On Free Will. Published in n+1 number 53 in June 2023, translated by Balance Y. Avant. Let, however, as in the Russia of the Great Civil War, the great forces of the historical field destine themselves to be aroused by the collisions of the new productive forces that press against the network of the old social forms that falter, it is then that in our image the historical atmosphere, the human social magma, presents itself Jonist, and if there were a Geiger counter of the revolution its hands would start dancing madly. The lines of force of the field are nailed to their trajectories, everything is polarized between two inexorable and antagonistic orientations, each element of the complex chooses its pole and rushes to the clash with the opposite one, the deadly doubt ends, every double game ignobly goes to hell, the individual molecule man runs in his array and flies along his line of force, finally forgetting that pathological idiocy that centuries of bewilderment decried as free will. Economic and Social Structure of Today's Russia, 1955. Introduction. In our explorations around the revolutionary theory of knowledge, we have arrived at the chapter we present here under the title Free Will. After overcoming some methodological stumbling blocks that had caused us some difficulty in developing the approach to the general scheme already outlined by our current in various studies dating back to the 1920s and 1960s, the work proceeded apace. The mostly unpublished materials that were collected, transcribed, recorded, and published were considered by us as good ground for further study for an era such as the present in which it seems that the party of revolution must detach itself from scientific reality and occupy only a political space. With the maturing of capitalism, it had happened that in general the whole of society had split, the humanities on one side, the sciences on the other. Even within the bourgeoisie, criticism of this situation had arisen. The bourgeoisie itself had denounced a contradiction by pointing out that handing over to parliaments composed of lawyers, designating by this term people who express opinions without basing them on a view derived from an analysis conducted with a scientific approach, the power to decide on matters of planetary scope is not only ridiculous, it is extremely dangerous. Part of the ruling class had begun to take this critical tendency very seriously, especially in the old capitalist countries, to the extent that a political current had arisen in industry, in the universities, and in the public squares that was able to mobilize millions of people. We dealt with this in the journal article number 47, The Great Socialization, analyzing subcurrents such as technocracy, Taylorism, Fordism, Plainism, and the planned economy. In the age of complexity, fuzzy logic and cybernetics, problems needed to be addressed accordingly. What its proponents had called the digital revolution did not begin with its eruption into the collective consciousness, it began with the first notches engraved by man on bone, the world's simplest calculator, notch yes, notch no, and following the millennia-old thread of time arrived at the modern computer, i.e. a machine for knowing ourselves and our surroundings. The first tool that man used to count was probably the double hand, with its 10 fingers, Engels, in evolution first the hand developed, only later the brain. This led to the spread of numbering in base 10, 1, 0, binary number system in computing. In the course of our study of this digital world, in which the book Men and Computers. Storia del Machinche Hanno Cambiato Illinois Mondo, by Daniel Casalegno, we dealt with the works of the fathers of computer science, Pascal, Leibniz, Jacquard, Babbage, Bull, Turing, von Neumann, up to the subject of artificial intelligence, a topic already addressed in the journal article Towards the Historical Singularity, with reference to the title of Raymond Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, 2008. Kurzweil subsequently published How to Create a Mind. The Secrets of Human Thought, 2013, an essay that should be read as a continuation of the previous one, and in which, addressing the topic of the ever-closer symbiosis between man and machine, he recounts current scientific research aimed at understanding the workings of the human brain in order to build ever more intelligent machines. Reading this book provided us with useful elements to link the two works, the one on digital and the one we are presenting on free will. In Kurzweil's book, in fact, the problem of consciousness and human freedom is raised. Consciousness is a philosophical difference between human brains and current computer programs. We consider human brains conscious, while we do not, at least for now, attribute this property to programs. Is this perhaps the factor we are looking for and which underlies free will? Does the difference between humans and computers lie in whether or not they have a conscience? But what is consciousness? As with the concept of a time, everyone thinks they know what it is, but when it comes to explaining it, then problems arise. In the article Principles of Organization that appeared in issue 13 of this journal, we highlighted how those working in the new fields of scientific research, complexity, chaos, dynamic systems, etc., are forced to capitulate ideologically in the face of revolutionary theory. The democratic principle, the sacredness of the individual, free will no longer stand up to the criticism of facts. On the other hand, if the functioning of human society rests on laws of nature, then free will cannot exist. Suffice it to recall that in the current social form, that of capitalism, wage slavery is in force, and modern slaves and modern slavers are perpetually at war, whether they want to be or not. As long as there is exploitation of man over man, there is a determined class struggle. In the magazine's issue on growing misery, we noted that income polarization, now noted by the bourgeoisie with the Gini index, has automatic consequences for the future of capitalist society. We did this using the Monte Carlo simulation, a method originated in the 1940s and used today in physics, chemistry, biology, etc., which is based on the probability of the distribution of incomes, and is universally applicable to any phenomenon of nature involving the possibility of using statistical analysis. Free will. In antiquity, men relied on fate. The gods intervened directly in human affairs to bring order. In the West in the Middle Ages, a single god ruled the whole of social life from above. Then, with Newtonian mechanics, a blow was dealt to the use of supernatural forces to explain the workings of nature and human behavior. To be fair, Newton attributes the origin and order of the universe to God's intelligent design, but his equations work just as well without appealing to the divine. The same bourgeois revolution that flies the flag of atheism by sweeping away the old conservative social forces, when it stabilizes its class domination, takes a step backwards by reconciling itself with religion, recognizing in it an important prop in defense of the established order. The term determinism was introduced in the early 19th century and became common in the philosophical sense around 1830. In the context of the theory of knowledge, this worldview was attacked in the course of the 20th century by existential theories of doubt. The future cannot be known, so describing the characteristics of tomorrow's society would be utopian. Now, it is true that there are impossible predictions, especially in complex systems, but there are no fortuitous phenomena in the sense of acausal. The various political currents of the bourgeois class, ranging from the historical right to social democracy via liberalism, all have cornerstones in common, such as the rights and duties of the individual, which the society of capital puts on a pedestal and blanders, while massifying and crushing it by means of the ideology of labor and the thousand consumerist fashions in circulation today. The current we refer to, and not only it, as we shall see in the conclusions, repeatedly rails against the abuse of the personal pronoun I, which also infiltrates communist circles, polluting them and conforming them to the dominant thought. But from bourgeois society, based on money and commodities, also emerge studies that attack the very foundations of bourgeois ideology. The scientist Francis Crick, for example, one of the discoverers of DNA, writes, "Your joys, your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact nothing more than the behavior of a vast organization of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Science and the Soul. A Hypothesis on Consciousness, 1994. The collapse of the idea of free will can, in the long run, undermine the existing political paradigm, which finds a fundamental prop in it. The historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, in his most famous work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, argues that the new scientific paradigm first makes its way within minorities, presenting itself as an anomaly that is opposed by normal science, but if it is not defeated theoretically, it tends to spread, and then a scientific revolution takes place. Communists are mutants, they anticipate a general change in society, both epistemological and material. The fact that the concept of free will is beginning to be criticized from many quarters is therefore of great interest to those who look to the future, since it is a symptom of profound upheavals, paving the way for revolution. Libert's temporal experiments. Let us therefore scrutinize these bourgeois studies that move on the borderlands, those in which the new knowledge matures. In Mind Time, the temporal factor in consciousness, the American neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet approaches the question of free will from the perspective of neuroscience, investigating the relationship between the mental and the physical through experiments. He was one of the first to analyze with the tools of neurophysiology the relationship between human brain activity and conscious action in performing a voluntary movement. He did this on the basis of the discovery by the German physiologists Hans Helmut Kornhuber and Luder Dieck of the motor readiness potential or Bereitschaftspotential, a signal that appears on the electroencephalogram prior to a voluntary movement. In his laboratory experiments in the 1960s, he invited volunteers to move the wrist of their right hand freely, i.e. when they wanted to, and to report the precise moment when they felt they had decided to do so. The aim of the experiment was to investigate the relationship between the consciousness of the onset of an act and the underlying neurophysiological dynamics. Libet used a special clock that was intended to allow a precise temporal location of the moment when the experimental subjects decided to bend their wrist. By means of an electromyogram, an electrophysiological diagnostic method, he recorded the muscle contraction in order to understand when the movement began. During the experiment, the subject's brain activity was also measured by means of electrodes placed on the head in order to determine the temporal potentials associated with movement. What did Libet discover with these experiments? That the motor readiness potential, the gradual increase in electrical activity that culminates in the execution of the movement, begins in the prefrontal motor areas of the brain before the moment when the subject thinks he has made the decision. We are talking about fractions of a second, a time that is imperceptible to us, but which nonetheless raises questions of no small importance for those dealing with this problem. The American neurophysiologist draws the conclusion that in these areas of the brain there would be a preconscious activity. In psychoanalysis, the preconscious system is halfway between the unconscious and consciousness that precedes true awareness by fractions of a second. Practically, we perceive that we want something that has already happened, we experience events from the past. The experiment is plausible as a principle, but somewhat primitive. With today's instruments, between neurochemistry and technical instrumentation, it is possible to measure more accurately what was not so in the 1960s. There are those who criticize this, such as the neuroscientist Aaron Scherger, who argues that the readiness potential Libet speaks of has no specific purpose, but is the result of spontaneous and partly random brain fluctuations, which, when they exceed a certain threshold, trigger action. It is clear, however, that on this type of fluctuations inherent in neuronal activity, we have no power. It is they that trigger the reaching of a threshold value necessary to determine the choice to act. The existence of free will, in one case, Scherger, as in the other, Libet, does not stand up. According to Libet, what we call consciousness would have a delayed effect from the moment when the brain prepares a series of activities that will lead the body to action. Consciousness, instead of being the acting cause, as most people think, is an epiphenomenon of action. Figure 1. The motor readiness potential begins approximately 1 second before the start of the movement, recorded by electromyography. For Libet, subjects become aware of their intention to perform the movement approximately 200 milliseconds before the start of the movement, then 800 milliseconds after the start of the preparatory activity for the movement. www.scienzainreti.it. Libet argues that the action is initially preconscious and consciousness only enters the scene at a later stage. There is a lapse of time measurable in thousandths of a second in which the individual can decide whether or not to move the wrist. Free will is thus saved in extremis by introducing the concept of free veto. Let us now see how the philosopher of the mind, Daniel Dennett, who has dealt with the problem of human freedom in many of his books, describes the volitional process. The action is originally initiated in some part of the brain, and from there the signals go out to the muscles, which on the way stop to tell you, the conscious agent, what is going on, but, like all good underlings, making you, the president, believe that you started the whole thing. Rather than the brain timing study by Libet, Dennett focuses on the distribution of information in the various areas of the brain. The times recorded by the neurophysiologist do not convince him, because the volunteers may not have been truly conscious of the moment they decided they had the consciousness to act. The difference in times, for example, could be due to the light reaching the retina from the clock face or factors not taken into account in the experiment. Dennett then asks, given that extremely complex processes take place in the brain, in which area of the organ should we place the so-called conscious agent? Where exactly in the brain is the decision to act taken? Only in the brain areas deputed to movement, or are other parts of the body also involved? Recent research suggests that it is the claustrum, a cellular lamina that connects via nerve fibers to almost all cortical regions, the area of our brain where consciousness arises. Aristotle, however, more than a couple of millennia ago, conceived the seat of consciousness and feelings not in the brain, for him a mere cooling organ, but in the heart. This thesis has been disproved by the facts, but science is proving that the brain is not the body's sole command center. The neurogastroenterologist Michael D. Gashon, for example, claims that the gut is the second brain since there are over 100 million neurons there. It is now scientifically accepted that the microbiome, the entire genetic makeup of the microorganisms housed in our bodies, can be compared to an additional organ. And the gut microbiota can communicate with the brain via the nervous system, influencing both the psyche and our cognitive functions. For Libet, there would be a positive actions, determined by completely unconscious neuronal processes, on which consciousness would later act, with the definitive and negative actions. But why should we consider negative actions to be qualitatively different from positive ones? Even so-called conscious actions could be determined by mechanisms of which the subject is not fully aware. Especially since, according to much research, much of the brain activity that takes place during our daily lives concerns the sphere of the unconscious. This aspect was intuited by Sigmund Freud, well before the advent of modern neuroscience, which would be much larger than what is defined as conscious. This is argued by neurosurgeon Giulio Maria in his essay The Brain is Bigger Than the Sky. It is estimated that as much as 95% of daily brain activity takes place in the unconscious. Of the almost 100 billion neurons, of the 100 trillion connections, our consciousness controls only 5%, most of the work is occult, hidden from ourselves. Moment after moment, the many structures that make up our brain exchange trillions of signals. Many of these activate functions that are essential for our survival, such as the control of breathing or heartbeat, the control of diuresis and the concentration of electrolytes in the blood, or those regulating the alternation of sleep and wakefulness, our body temperature, and so on. Yet, only a small part of the vast and complex amount of this information reaches a level of awareness, i.e. it involves the prefrontal cortex. A lot of the mental work that produces impressions, intuitions, and many decisions also takes place in the silence of the brain. It would be interesting to understand how such precise percentages of total brain activity, 95% unconscious, 5% conscious, could be established. In this case, it seems that the term unconscious is used as a synonym for unknown. The language shows all the limitations of the current state of knowledge of the brain. The neuroscientist Vilayanu Subramanian Ramachandran, in What Do We Know About the Mind, elaborated a theory of the brain similar to Libet's. Since we have about 30 billion neurons in the neocortex, he says, a lot happens in that area, and we are aware of a very small part of it. The neocortex, considered to be the seat of higher cognitive functions, memory, language, learning, constantly processes decisions, large and small, and the proposed solutions then emerge to our conscious awareness. Rather than free will, Ramachandran suggests that we should speak of free veto, i.e. the faculty to reject or approve the solutions proposed by the non-conscious parts of our brain. Another neuroscientist, Antonio Damasio, in his essay Descartes' Error, defines consciousness as a somatic marker, that pleasant or unpleasant sensation felt by the individual when the positive or negative outcome attached to a response option comes to mind. Damasio places a lot of importance on emotions, joy, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise, in the formation of ideas, and in doing so slips into psychology. The conscious will would be nothing more than an emotion of paternity that serves to identify the owner of the action in the self, serves to have memory of one's activities. It is useful, therefore, for understanding who we are and who we are not. More simply, we can define emotions as a series of survival mechanisms evolved to allow us to avoid danger, as journalist Rita Carter writes in the essay Mapping the Mind. Overcoming the law. Bourgeois society is ideologically founded on the category of free will, especially from a legal point of view. The mind decides and the body executes. The mind is responsible for what the body does. But genetics and neuroscience, as we are seeing, are beginning to challenge this conception. The mind is strictly determined by the brain, and the latter is at one with the body, which is embedded in a physical, biological, and social environment. However, the debate is open. According to many neuroscientists, the mind does not exist. Others claim that the brain is the organ and the mind the function. According to neuroscientist Giorgio Valortigara, it is possible to explain any segment of behavior without any reference to intentionality, which also deprives the distinction between informational and communicative signals of meaning. In the book Are We Really Free? La Neuroscience e Illinois Mistero del Libro Arbitrio, Neuroscience and the Mystery of Free Will, edited by De Caro, Lavazza and Sartori, there is a chapter entitled If We Are Not Free, Can We Be Punished?, in which it is argued that the findings of neuroscience go against common sense and law, because consciousness would have little or no influence on our behavior. On the other hand, to be held responsible for an action an individual would have to be the first and only cause of it. Yet, in criminal law we have remained stuck at a pre-scientific, philosophical stage, we might say. Nothing to be surprised about, since the concept of right concerns the last revolution, the bourgeois one, which had equality, freedom and property written on its flag, and will certainly not concern the future one. In the Italian Penal Code, the legislator takes an axiomatic stance on the existence of free will. The individual is responsible for the actions he performs, and this evidence cannot be questioned. And the US Supreme Court has ruled. A universal and abiding cornerstone of our legal system, and particularly in our approach to punishment, adjudication, and incarceration, is the belief in the freedom of the human will and the consequent capacity and duty of ordinary persons to choose between good and evil. United States v. Grayson, 1978. These are lapidary statements, but they are challenged by the results that neuroscientific research is coming up with. Lavazza and Samicelli, in their book The Crime of the Brain. La mente tra scienza e diritto, The Mind Between Science and Law, propose the need for an overcoming of the axiom of the free and undetermined will, an axiom founded on the assumption that every action is the result of a conscious intention of the subject. Let us remember that already in the 19th century, the physician Cesare Lombroso, founder of criminal anthropology and exponent of positivism, influenced by physiognomy and phrenology, had tried to give a materialistic reading of crime based not on free will, but on physiology. He wanted to refound the penal experience on a scientific basis. He did not succeed, but his studies, which can be criticized as much as one likes, are better than those of many of today's philosophers and idealists. The famous median occipital dimple, according to Lombroso, is an anomaly of the cranial structure, and is the source of deviant behavior, hence the theory of the born criminal. Obviously, if a criminal act is not a free act, but is biologically determined, punishment makes no sense. It makes sense, if anything, for Lombroso to put the criminal in the condition of doing no harm. In the USA, functional magnetic resonance imaging or positron emission tomography, PET, scans are often presented by the defense during trials to assess the functionality of specific brain areas of defendants. The lawyer's aim is to highlight neurological lesions or defects that override the defendant's voluntary control. It is his brain, not his self, that is responsible for that action, argues the defense to exonerate the defendant. We have seen some of the tools and codes the bourgeoisie employs to curb behavior it deems deviant, but how will the revolutionary dictatorship solve the problem of punishment in the phase transition from N to N+1? The problems facing the communists will be enormous, and we know that the future society will have to defend itself against antisocial behavior, the legacy of the old one, but it will do so without resorting to principles that have no scientific basis. Marxist materialism gets the concepts of guilt and even punishment out of the way. The Red Dictatorship will abolish the death penalty, in the sense that by historical determination death will remain, but there will be no punishment. With this it will also bring down two romantic figures, the Boher, executioner, and Cesare Beccaria, Caesar. Blooming Springs of Capital, 1953. Between neuroscience, philosophy, and logic. The analytical philosopher Peter van Inwagen is a proponent of the thesis that no human being, because of our cognitive limitations, can solve the mystery of human freedom. It seems so obvious to me that finding a solution to this problem is impossible that I find a suggestion recently made by Noam Chomsky very interesting. According to Chomsky, in our biology, in the way thought is installed in our brains, there is something that makes it impossible for us human beings to solve the mystery of metaphysical freedom. Be that as it may, I am certain that I cannot solve the mystery, and I am equally certain that no one else has done so. Van Inwagen sees the question of free will as an unfathomable mystery. It seems impossible that it exists, but at the same time it is impossible that it does not exist, so the impossible seems to exist. Quite a headache for philosophers, and not only for them. The physicist Max Planck also addressed the subject with an essay entitled Law of Causality and Free Will. In his scientific work, he also dealt with epistemology and came across the problem of human freedom. The impossibility of subjecting one's present self to causal law has very deep roots. It is as logical in origin as the principle that a part can never be greater than the whole. It is an impossibility from which not even the highest intelligence, not even a Laplacian mind, could escape. Even if this could perfectly causally explain the most ingenious activities of a human brain, its art would immediately fail if it wanted to apply the causal law to its own brain. We are therefore faced with a logical loop. One part cannot understand the whole, as Kurt Gödel argued with his famous paradox. The decision problem, i.e. whether or not an utterance is deducible within the reference system, had been posed by the mathematician David Hilbert in 1928, and then taken up a few years later by Alonzo Church, an unsolvable problem of elementary number theory, 1936, and Alan Turing, on computable numbers, with an application to the Entscheidungs problem, 1937, who gave a negative answer. Church and Turing's work on the problem raised by Hilbert laid the foundations of computability theory. Like Van Inwagen, who believes it is impossible to solve the problem of free will, philosopher Colin McGinn is an advocate of the thesis that the mind is made in such a way that it cannot understand itself. First-hand experience cannot be described in scientific terms. In his article, Can We Solve the Mind-Body Problem?, he writes, "We have tried for a long time to solve the mind-body problem, but it has stubbornly resisted our best efforts. The mystery persists. I think it is therefore time to admit frankly that we cannot solve it." According to McGinn, we are constitutively lacking the capacity to form concepts that encompass all possible types of conscious states, i.e. we have insurmountable cognitive limits. The human brain, on the other hand, developed for the survival of the organism, i.e. to anticipate future scenarios, went through various evolutionary stages, reptilian brain, limbic system, cerebral cortex, and only later began to question the functioning of itself, adopting various cognitive tools, first religion, then philosophy and, finally, science. The latter form of knowledge, freed from the material and ideological shackles imposed by the present social form, is the one that will enable humanity to take a step forward in understanding how it understands. We can go so far as to scientifically deny the existence of free will, but the idea that we lack it remains inconceivable to many. The fact that current knowledge has limits does not mean that on a species level there are problems with roots in the physical world that are recognized as insoluble forever. Scientific research, as such, is always open to new investigations, to new ways of explaining and defining the world. It has been discovered, for example, that the ability to overcome the contradictions of a formal system can only be acquired by stepping outside the system and placing oneself beyond it, in a higher-level system. One can only conceive of a system other than capitalism by projecting oneself into a post-capitalist system, by adopting its way of thinking in advance. Planck, although a man of science, was a believer, and he says that one can only get out of this impasse through faith. Since man is made in the image and likeness of God, his soul is not subject to the determinism that governs nature. God and man have the ability to choose, nature does not. In truth, if we abstract ourselves, from our individualities, we must admit that we are not made of a different matter from that of which the rest of nature is composed, as Einstein claims. A being, endowed with a higher capacity for understanding and a more perfect intelligence, who looked at man and his actions, would smile at the human illusion of acting according to freedom. This is my opinion, although I am well aware that it is not fully demonstrable. Man refuses to be considered an impotent object in relation to the course of the universe. But should the legality of events, as it reveals itself more or less clearly in inorganic nature, be interrupted by the activities of our brain? Einstein takes a monistic view of the universe, arguing that man and his mind must respond to the same causal laws that govern the whole. Of course, we agree with him, and we will explain why by rereading and commenting on a classic by Marx and Engels, demonstrating that the answers we seek are, on closer inspection, already present in our texts. Manifesto of Social Determinism. Let us make it clear from the outset that for communists, the question of free will has been resolved at least since 1848, the year of the great revolutionary upheavals in Europe and the exposition of grand visions of the future. There is in fact a close connection between revolution and knowledge. To frame the problem of human freedom, we therefore refer to the thesis concerning determinism contained in the Communist Party Manifesto, which states that history is not made by individuals, or even generic human groups, but by classes. They are formed by social molecules that have common interests and are directed by forces beyond their capacity to control. In the first chapter of the manifesto, Bourgeois and Proletarians, which we will quote extensively, we find written, "The history of society hitherto is the history of class struggle. We would like to show that classes are not something static, that remain unchanged over time, but are dynamic realities, and have been formed in the same way as other structures in nature, such as tectonic plates which, in colliding with each other, have produced immense shocks that have transformed matter, producing the birth of new forms. Modern bourgeois society, born on the ruins of feudalism, did not remove class frictions, it only created new classes, new conditions of oppression and new forms of struggle in place of the old ones." Bourgeois and Proletarians. There is therefore an invariance between the various class societies, in the succession of modes of production, oppression and struggle remain. However, there are transformations, that is, there are new forms of oppression and therefore new forms of struggle. And political bodies that do not catch up with the times in this becoming are destined to succumb. The primitive forms of organization of the labor movement, such as secret sects, give way to more evolved forms, such as trade unions and political parties. By identifying invariances and transformations, we can make science of the class struggle, elaborate a doctrine of modes of production, something that has been done by our current and on which we naturally rely. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, is nevertheless characterized by a simplification in the class struggle. The whole of society is splitting more and more into two vast enemy camps, into two classes facing each other, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the centuries-long struggle between these two classes, one will emerge victorious and the other defeated. There can be no middle ground. According to communist theory, the outcome of this epochal clash is already written, as stated by Amadeo Bordiga in Relativity and Determinism. In Mort di Albert Einstein, 1955. The Shaw coordinates of the communist revolution are written as valid solutions of the laws demonstrated in the space-time of history. There are historical causes that determined the advent of the capitalist mode of production and its consolidation over time, and these are precisely listed in the manifesto: the discovery of America, the development of trade, navigation, trafficking, etc. The bourgeoisie becomes the class representing the new mode of production, which has as its aim the valorization of capital and tends to break every barrier to its movement, autonomizing itself from human society itself and making everyone dance to its music. Hence the development of imperialism, the supreme phase of capitalism, for which the term globalization was coined. The bourgeoisie is increasingly suppressing the small means of production, property and fractional population. It aggregates the population and centralizes the means of production in a few hands. The necessary consequence was political centralization. Bourgeois and proletarians. And in this passage, in which the genesis of armored democracy is explained, we have the key to understanding the historical phenomenon that is fascism, which is not so much a form of government, but the modern way of being of capitalist society, democracy, fascism, communism. We see, then, how the means of production and traffic, on whose foundations the bourgeoisie was built, were generated within feudal society. To a certain degree of their development, the production and trade methods of feudal society, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing no longer corresponded. In a word, feudal property relations were unsuited to the already developed productive forces. They hampered production instead of facilitating it. They became obstacles. They had to be pulled down, and they were. Bourgeois and proletarians. Capitalism was formed within feudal society, factories, mutation of the artisan into a worker, and before our eyes a similar motion is taking place today as the rise of the bourgeoisie, automated factories, worker replaced by robots. By studying the transition from feudalism to bourgeois society, we can understand what the transition from capitalist mode of production to communism will be like. However, it is important to bear in mind the binomial invariance transformation, because today it is not a question of replacing one class with another, one oppression with another. The class that will take society from system N to N+1 has the aim of negating itself and with it all classes. And tomorrow's revolutionary party, from being an organism in struggle against other parties, will lose its political envelope and turn into a species organism. Naples Thesis, 1965. Bourgeois society is increasingly out of control. It cannot control the gigantic forces it has conjured up, and given the multiplication and amplification of crises, economic, climatic, political, etc., the bourgeoisie have coined the term polycrisis. On the horizon, however, there is not only chaos and disorder, but marked symptoms of future society are visible, from the exchange of files without value consideration, P2P, to the automation of production processes. Everything shows us that the present mode of production has had its day. The bourgeoisie is the product of historical development, and at a certain point also becomes a factor in it, when it becomes an instrument of the new mode of production in struggle against the old French Revolution. But with the consolidation of capitalism, its strength is reduced and capitalists are dispossessed of their role by becoming salaried functionaries. Capital, which has become anonymous and impersonal, demonstrates that its power is based exclusively on social labor, i.e. the cooperation of millions and millions of wage earners. On the other hand, as Marx notes in Capital, the partial worker cannot produce any commodity, not even a bolt or a screw. Only the collective labor of partial workers is truly productive. The proletariat makes its appearance with the birth of capitalism and, like the latter, goes through various degrees of development. Its struggle against the bourgeoisie begins with its existence. Initially, it adopts the watchwords of the bourgeoisie: liberty, equality, fraternity, and in some cases refers to the fundamental concepts of Christianity: all men are equal before God. In short, at first it struggles to differentiate itself politically and organizationally from the enemy class, but after a long and bloody series of struggles, contingent victories and major defeats, proceeding by trial and error, like a cybernetic mechanism, if this happens, then I do this other, it develops its own worldview, its own theory, its own political program. The Communist Manifesto is the product of revolutions and counter-revolutions and the collective reflection on them. It testifies to the proletariat's achieved programmatic autonomy from the ideology of the ruling class and is the battle cry of the modern slaves against modern slave society. It is a turning point in human history, a decisive turning point. But the old social form does not remain passive in the face of an increasingly threatening proletariat. It realizes that brutal repression is not enough, and so it flatters and bribes the leaders of proletarian organizations in order to appease the enemy class. Reformism, which is the opposite of revolution, is a social force whose purpose is to keep the proletariat clinging to the capitalist social form. It is a physical fact derived from the vitality and strength of the wage labor system. Reformism is an antibody developed by capitalism against a very dangerous virus, communism. Today, given the comatose state capitalism is in, the reformist movement has lost much of its strength. See the disappearance of the Stalinist parties and the dissolution of the social democratic ones, but it cannot be said to have disappeared. It has the capacity to reappear in disguise. While the other classes tend to dissolve with the development of big industry, the proletariat is the only class to grow numerically and become stronger, being its specific product. According to the International Labour Organization, there are 2.8 billion wage earners in the world. The various sources examined for this paper estimate the numerical size of the wage-earning class at between 2 and 3 billion, an invincible force if it were organized. However, we would like to specify, for the avoidance of misunderstanding, that organization is a determined process. It does not come about simply by someone's will, also because, first comes the struggle and then the organization, as the history of the three communist internationals shows. In the long run, the bourgeoisie can no longer control the dominated class because it is unable to guarantee its existence, because instead of being nourished by it, it is forced to feed it. It can no longer make society live in its own way, it can no longer guarantee the reproduction of capitalist social relations. At a certain point, bourgeois society becomes a shell that no longer corresponds to its content. Lenin. The first chapter of the manifesto, Bourgeois and Proletarians, unfolds chronologically following the stages of development of capitalism, and concludes thus. With the development of big industry, the ground on which it produces and appropriates products thus escapes under the very feet of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie produces above all its own gravedigger. Its demise and the triumph of the proletariat are equally inevitable. In the last two lines of the quotation are condensed fundamental doctrinal aspects, which many so-called communists do not take into due consideration or find difficult to digest fully. Some, annoyed by too much determinism, bring up the passage in the manifesto which speaks of the common ruin of the classes in struggle to question the inevitability of communism. This is a gross error. It is not that the common ruin of the classes prevents the revolutionary transformation of society. If anything, it delays it, in a way that may even be tragic for humanity. With millions or even billions of deaths, it is a thermodynamic regression of the system, a return to low levels of order, an n+1 involution, a loss of information of the system itself. But, according to the communist left scheme, after n+1, there is n, and after that n+1. Bourgeois society does not so much produce its murderer as its gravedigger. On the other hand, capital is already dead, it is a corpse that still walks. It is not a question of killing it, but of burying it. The inevitable end of bourgeois rule is not a mere hope, but is decreed by laws of nature, those described by Marx and studied by our current in the post-World War II period, Property and Capital and Marxist economic science as a revolutionary program, where the theory of capitalist waste is addressed. In addition to being the program of a class, which by its action makes itself the representative of the species, the manifesto is the manifesto of social determinism. Classes are described as physical structures, which were formed as a result of historical processes, and superstructures follow a similar movement. They are born, mature and die, to make way for new world views, for more advanced paradigms. The communist program comes from the future, it anticipates the knowledge of tomorrow's social man, and scientific materialism is nothing other than the use of science in the social sphere. Marxism makes science of social facts and thus of modes of production, and to do this requires numbers, quantities, measurements, as Galileo and Newton taught, who could make science of gravity by measuring masses, accelerations, and forces. In all the quotations in the manifesto there is no room for human choice, for free will. There is not even mention of particular individuals making history. A real movement is described, an objective one, which the scientists Marx and Engels scientifically analyzed. Their laboratory is bourgeois society, which is nothing but a subsystem of nature. Theme, this, which we developed in Oration in Death of the Trinity Religion, Philosophy and Science, n+1 n 15-16. That struggled between natural elements, i.e. earthquakes, hurricanes, eruptions, tides, continental drifts, etc., is part of the formation of the world. During this struggle, nature knows itself, writes its own history in the geological strata, in the formation of carbon compounds, which can be either oil or protocells anticipating the living, with their baggage stored in molecular sequences anticipating DNA. DNA, in fact, can be explained by information theory, since it is an encoding of genetic information, necessary for the formation and development of living beings. The formation of the world as it is occurred due to structures that collided, i.e. through struggle. These natural breaks, caused by differences, in turn cause other differences, increasing the complexity and organization of matter. The doctrine of modes of production is thus to be included in the more general process of natural evolution. It is no coincidence that Marx sent a copy of the Capital to Charles Darwin. In the history of social structures, there is no room for voluntarism, but only for the impersonal action of large human collectivities, by which we mean the movement of millions of men, as outlined so well in the communist left scheme of reversal of praxis. But if everything is determined, if revolution is an inevitable fact, what is the point of getting together and writing articles or leaflets? The answer we give to this question is very simple. We are not the ones who have chosen to do what we do. We are not the ones who have chosen to be communists. Oh yes, we lack even this freedom. We have not chosen to link ourselves to a particular political current, but a series of causal concatenations of a historical, environmental, etc. nature has driven us to be what we are, to arrive at certain conclusions and not others. Communists are those who have been captured by the demon of communism, as written in the letter to Comrades, number 31, Dangerous Demons, 1995. The abandonment of one path in order to adhere to the other is a determined product that varies from individual to individual, just as understanding of an involvement with the revolutionary program varies, but always one is faced with a situation that excludes a choice. One can say that one does not even adhere to the revolutionary program, one is objectively inside it, in the sense described by Marx. The Communist Party is not only open to the workers, it finds suitable instruments in all classes, there do not have to be only proletarians within it, since the militant communist and revolutionary comrade is he who has been able to forget, to deny, to tear from his mind and heart the classification in which the registry of this rotting society inscribed him. The revolutionary militant, whether a worker on strike or a scientist moving on the borderlands between old and new knowledge, while working for the revolution may well not be aware of it. The communist does not adhere to the program but is caught up in it, knowledge of the theory comes later. The proletariat tends to clash with the existing social form before it is aware of what it historically wants to achieve with its struggle, but it does so because it is driven by a physical force, which in the early stages is economic appetite. This biological pressure, particularly strong in an irrational mode of production such as capitalism, makes us anything but free. As Douglas Hofstadter writes, it makes no sense to claim that our needs are somehow free, or that our decisions are. Needs and decisions are the result of physical events inside our heads. How can they be free? A scientist like Hofstadter, who does not call himself a Marxist, is much more of a Marxist than many who call themselves Marxists and are steeped to the core in voluntarist idealism, a subject we will return to later. Determinism and indeterminism. When speaking of free will, it is imperative to address two related issues, the thesis concerning determinism, and this is what we have just done, and the thesis concerning indeterminism. If one is true, the other is false, there can be no middle ground. For free will to exist, there must be at least two conditions, says those who deal with the subject. 1. The individual has before him various courses of action, and thus has the possibility of taking one course of action or another. 2. The choice must be determined by the agent, or at least the agent must participate in it. One who has a gun to his head cannot freely choose what to do. In the Treccani's free will entry, in the first line, we find the following: the capacity to choose freely, in acting and judging. The Oxford English Dictionary's definition is as follows: the faculty of an individual to make free choices, not determined by divine predestination, the laws of physical causality, fate, etc. For determinism, every event is the result of other events, of relations between them, there is therefore a causal chain, and every fact can be investigated in accordance with the laws of nature. Determinism, in the final analysis, is the only conception of reality and history that makes it possible to do science, i.e. to identify invariants and transformations, and thus to be able to make predictions. For indeterminism, on the other hand, there are events that are uncaused or only probabilistically caused. But on the subject of probability it is good to clarify, it is used for the description of chaotic deterministic systems. For the mathematician Bruno de Finetti, for example, it makes no sense to speak of the probability of an event except in relation to the set of knowledge a person has. In quantum mechanics, the probability distribution is determined. What is difficult to measure is the individual event, because the person doing the measuring changes it. Statistics is a deterministic discipline. If there are statistical regularities in the dynamics of social facts, it is clear that there is a deterministic substratum. Then there are the middle ways, or the positions of those who want to keep goat and cabbage, determinism and free will, together, and we refer to the current that in both the philosophical and scientific fields is defined as compatibilist, and which sees one of its best-known representatives in Thomas Hobbes, who in Leviathan, in 1651, wrote, "Freedom and necessity do not contradict each other, as in water, which has not only freedom, but a necessity to descend by a conduit. In the same way, the voluntary actions of men, in so far as they derive from their will, derive from freedom, and yet, in so far as every act of the human will, and every desire and inclination, derives from one cause, and this from another cause, in an unbroken chain whose first link is in the hands of God, the first cause, they derive from necessity." Let us see, at this point, what one of our contemporary compatibilists, Daniel Dennett, who oscillates between determinism and indeterminism, has to say. He argues that determinism could be compatible with certain types of free will. In his book The Evolution of Freedom, he describes the evolution of life as a progression of living forms, from the binary choice of unicellular organisms, food yes, food no, give up no, and go towards yes, to a broader range of choices that is peculiar to the mammalian class, among which is our species. Compatibilists are dualists, they admit the existence of material causes and determinations, but in the end they do not deny the existence of free will, and thus of creation. The philosopher John Searle, for example, while criticizing some aspects of compatibilism, adopts its principles in full. He supports the existence of neurobiological determinism but denies that it is sufficient to explain the psychological event of intentional action. He comes to the conclusion that the human mind possesses intentionality and the computer does not, and therefore the computer cannot have a mind. Hence also the denial of any hypothesis of strong artificial intelligence, capable of fully replicating human intelligence. This thesis is outdated, now the overtaking seems really close. Think of the appeal launched by Elon Musk and signed by 1,000 academics, luminaries, and technology experts to call for a 6-month moratorium on the training of generative AI such as ChatGPT, because it could get out of the control of its creators. These technologies are based on machine learning, that branch of artificial intelligence that makes it possible to learn or improve systems and machines based on the data they use. It is divided into two branches: supervised machine learning, where the role of the programmer is still fundamental, and unsupervised machine learning, where algorithms recognize complex processes and patterns without human guidance. Generative artificial intelligence systems, such as ChatGPT, are replacing humans in many tasks, which, according to a study by the Goldman Sachs Bank, could make up to 300 million jobs globally redundant in the near future. Researchers working in the field are concerned about the increasing autonomy acquired by machines. They fear that generative AIs may lead to situations that are not in line with the goals for which they were designed. Some of them are calling for the establishment of an international agency for artificial intelligence, convinced that yet another bureaucratic bandwagon, without executive powers, can regulate the development of productive forces. But something similar is happening in technology to what happened with biological evolution, when elementary components began to assemble in the primordial soup to produce more complex components. Life evolved from non-living molecules, and it is not certain that tomorrow an intelligence more powerful than the carbon-based one might not emerge from silicon. The machine might even come up with new patterns of knowing, different from the biological ones. Returning to Daniel Dennett, we have dealt with his work in a couple of articles, A World of Infinite Relationships, number 33, and Doing, Saying, Thinking, Knowing, number 38. We also reviewed 2 of his books in the magazine, as we consider what he has written to be interesting and certainly a stimulus to our in-depth study of the subject. In The Evolution of Freedom, it is said that man does not only respond to determinism, he has ceased to be determined by the natural environment and has even begun to modify it. For Dennett, this human capacity to transform matter makes man emancipate himself from the brute necessity that constrains the rest of the animal species. This thesis may well seem reasonable, but to emphasize the attainment of human freedom is cause for suspicion. And indeed, in the book's ending, the current philosophical and political categories are fully accepted, where of freedom means the treasures of modern education, equal rights for women, better health habits, workers' rights, democratic ideals, and openness to the cultures of others. In Consciousness What It Is, Dennett observes instead that any relatively simple program, such as a computer-type program that performs assigned tasks, is completely devoid of consciousness. It merely transforms strings of symbols into other strings of symbols. This mechanical process makes possible the extreme power of modern computers, which have reached a good level of brain simulation. In this, the American philosopher seems to take up the mechanistic theories of the Enlightenment philosopher Julian Offray de la Mettrie set out in his essay L'Humo Mac China, 1747, where the world of the born and the world of the produced are approached materialistically by means of a unitary principle of organization. To understand how computers work, it is therefore necessary to understand how the brain works. In The Mind and Minds, another book by Dennett, it is stated that macromolecules, like unicellular beings, function like little robots, i.e. automatically and unconsciously. There are mechanical mutations, and the cells of our organism are like self-replicating automata capable of performing a restricted set of tasks. However, their cooperation leads to a complex result, which is what we call life. Our brain does not have a control room in which a single homunculus works, but is composed of a series of rooms and homuncules with limited capacities that cooperate with each other to achieve goals, and the result of this cooperation is greater than the mere sum of the parts. As physicist Michio Kaku argues in his essay The Future of the Mind, the concept of I, understood as a single unit that makes all decisions, is an illusion created by our own unconscious. We are convinced that our mind is a single entity that processes information continuously and smoothly, in charge of all our decisions. However, the picture that emerges from brain scans is quite different. Even the computer scientist Marvin Minsky, in his book The Society of the Mind, argues that in the mind there is no traffic warden directing traffic, but there are a whole series of modules and submodules cooperating with each other, and from this incessant working of small, unintelligent parts emerges the complex thing we call mind. The belief in free will is false. The physical world does not contemplate it, even though in everyday life we take it for granted that it exists. Competence without understanding. Most living organisms have competence without understanding. They know what to do without anyone having explained it to them beforehand, because they are biologically programmed. On this subject, Dennett in the book From Bacteria to Bark, How the Mind Evolves, gives the example of the automatic lift, which has skills without being aware of its own functioning, skills that consist of stopping at the floor requested by the passenger. Even our organism is composed of expert systems that are programmed to solve problems without needing to understand them, without having consciousness. Think for example of the immune system. The neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, father of the integrated information theory, argues that a physical system is conscious to the extent that it is able to integrate information from differentiated parts. In the case of the brain, consciousness would be the result of the integration of information coming from many of its areas, and is in some way measurable. Thus, more integration of information equals more consciousness. In nature, there are stimuli that modify the behavior of the living being. Let's take an example. If it is too hot, man looks for a place where it is cooler. He behaves like a thermostat, a system capable of releasing or absorbing heat without changing its own temperature. In nature, the living organism either adapts to the environment or succumbs. If biological adaptation, i.e. the ability to solve a problem, is successful, then it tends to spread. This is how the logic of the living and also the logic of computers work. In order to understand the structure of the mind, we need to use the reverse engineering method, i.e. to reverse engineer, to investigate how we came to be what we are, i.e. to deduce from an achievement the steps we took to get there. The computer is an externalization of ourselves. Studying its workings, its history, serves to understand our own. On the other hand, the history of industry is an integral part of our biological evolution, and now thanks to the achievements of the industrial system, we are beginning to understand more about ourselves. Let's think of the ambitious Human Brain Project, directed by neuroscientist Henry Markram, in which dozens of universities and research centers are collaborating. The project aims to decrypt the human brain, that is, to understand how its parts interact with each other, at the micro, meso, and macro scale, bringing together knowledge from neuroscience, information technology, and communications. Dennett seems to be in line with our immaterialistic conception when he talks about computational theory of mind, but then he brings complexity into play, whereby small variations in parameters can have huge effects. Which is true, complexity exists in nature, small initial variations produce large final changes, but this does not justify indeterminism. According to Dennett, it is not true that there is only a physically possible future for each instant. However, he reiterates that we are what we are only because of an iron determinism based on simple rules. An obvious contradiction, like claiming that we are no longer subject to natural constraints. To a materialist, this is nonsense. Given the state of the universe, at any given time there is only a deterministically possible future. That one does not have the necessary tools to prove this at the level of quantum mechanics is another matter, which concerns the current limits of knowledge. However, as mentioned earlier, if there is a branch of physics that goes by the name of statistical mechanics, and which uses probability theory to study the behavior of systems composed of a large number of particles, it means that there are regularities in the micro-world. Not only are we subject to natural constraints, but also to social constraints, which are just as strong. They are like chains. What is more, write Marx, we still live in human prehistory, we are naked apes, Desmond Morris, and not even in the future society will we be completely free. Absolutes in nature do not exist, as we will still be bound by the universal law of gravitation. But then, are not the social ones also natural constraints? And isn't communism the culmination of a long and arduous evolutionary process? Of an evolution that is not gradual but proceeds in leaps and bounds as in the sawtooth diagram of the communist left? Incompatibilists argue, and we agree with this thesis, that if there is free will, there is no determinism, and vice versa. In the world of incompatibilism, there are two antithetical currents, the determinists and the libertarians. The libertarians claim, in order to defend the indeterministic thesis, the incompatibility between the laws of the micro-world, quantum mechanics, and the laws of the macro-world, classical mechanics, and want to prove that the universe cannot be treated as a totality. There would be different levels of the world and different laws, applicable to one and not to the other. Mind, for example, according to some, would exist through the amplification of quantum chaos. The physicist Federico Fagin, father of the microprocessor, slipping completely into indeterminism, goes so far as to claim that free will exists and is quantum in nature. In his book Irreducible Consciousness, Life, Computers, and Our Nature, which deals with philosophy rather than physics, he writes, I believe that it is impossible to explain life without the concepts of consciousness and free will, because the two are inextricably linked to the quantum classical aspects of physical reality in ways that we have yet to investigate and understand. A living organism can act as a unit endowed with free will, intention, purpose, and meaning, properties that cannot be derived from a bag of unconscious atoms and molecules probabilistically interacting with each other. Consciousness is what gives perception and understanding to the organism, while free will is what enables it to act as a unified entity with its own intention and based on the understanding of consciousness. Physical indeterminism, however, on closer inspection, does not guarantee the freedom of the individual, so much defended by libertarians. On the contrary, it would make it impossible. If the world were truly indeterminate, human actions themselves, like physical events, could not be determined even by those who perform them. Not even those who initiate an action could have the certainty of determining it, because it is chance that decides. So how can one make short, medium, and long-term plans if one has no control over them? The defenders of human freedom, the libertarians, whether right-wing or left-wing, it matters little, therefore find themselves denying their very raison d'etre, freedom. Therefore, to make the existence of free will possible, the individual, or collective, self should have the power to initiate new causal chains without being determined by them. Agents endowed with these powers are comparable to the prime movers of Aristotelian memory. In Aristotle's thought, in fact, the prime mover represents the first cause of the universe's becoming. Creationists also find a place in the revolutionary sphere. They are the ones who argue that it is time to create the conditions for the resumption of the class struggle, that we need to roll up our sleeves, get busy, create favorable power relations for the proletariat, create the Communist Party, as if this were something that could be built at the table. The anti-scientific attitude is thus present even in circles that should adopt a scientific, hence deterministic, approach to the study of social facts. Let us hear how our current approaches the subject in Straightening the Legs of Dogs, 1952. History is made by men, only they know very little about why they make it and how they make it. But in general, all that sufferers of human action, and the mockers of an alleged fatalist automatism, on the one hand are those who cherish, in their own inner whole, the idea of having that predestined man in their little body, and on the other hand are precisely those who have understood nothing and can do nothing, not even understanding that history does not gain or lose a tenth of a second, whether they sleep like dormice or realize their generous dream of wriggling like obsessives. Some critics of determinism, also communists, argue that only by talking about actions, and therefore wills, can we describe human behavior, otherwise we enter the realm of physics, and instead of the agential, mental, vocabulary we use that of the natural sciences treating man as a cluster of atoms and molecules, as does, for example, physicist Mark Buchanan with his Physics of History. By using the natural sciences to explain the workings of human society, say the defenders of humanistic knowledge, or supposedly so, we will go so far as to deny the contribution of human culture, starting with literary and artistic knowledge, etc. But are we really sure of this? For Marxism, it is not a question of denying human culture, but of explaining its material origin. Men make history, of course, but they do not necessarily know at all times what they are doing or what they will do. It is then a question of resting history on its feet, matter, and not on its head, ideas, of overturning current practice. The humanists fear that with the imposition of a materialist conception of history, humanistic knowledge will be downgraded in relation to scientific knowledge, but the species, having reached this stage of development of the productive forces, cannot help but resort to the unification of knowledge. As said before, there is no third way between determinism and indeterminism, and compatibilism, in the scientific field, is a kind of reformism, which wants to hold opposites together. All those who fall into indeterminism cannot find a solution to the problem of free will and are forced to turn outside physics, and invent God or some other form of creation. The extended mind. Steven Pinker, an American cognitive scientist, in one of his famous books, How the Mind Works, in a few lines denies the notion of free will, showing all its flaws. That science, no matter how much it discovers, seems to corrode free will is undoubted, because scientific explanations are not compatible with the mysterious notion of an uncaused cause underlying the will. If scientists wanted to prove that free will exists, what would they have to look for? Some random neural event that the rest of the brain amplifies into a signal that triggers behavior. But a random event no more accords with the concept of free will than a regular one, and cannot be the much sought-after locus of moral responsibility. The issue raised by Pinker refers to another author, neuroscientist Michael S. Gazzaniga. He too, having the results of Libet's experiments in mind, questions how the concept of free will can be considered. Libet determined that the potentials of the brain are operating 350 milliseconds before you have the conscious intention to act. So, before you are conscious of thinking you want to move an arm, your brain is already preparing to make that movement. Gazzaniga, The Mind's Past, 1998. Only fractions of a second after the action has started, there is awareness, and at that moment, says Libet, the green or red disc lights up, continue the action or block it. Since Libet's initial experiments, as early psychologists predicted, the tests have become more sophisticated. Thanks to fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, today we no longer think of the brain as a static system, but as a constantly active dynamic system. Using these techniques, in 2008 John Dylan Haynes and colleagues furthered Libet's experiments by showing that the results of the impulse to do something can be encoded in brain activity up to 10 seconds before they enter the stream of consciousness. Gazzaniga, Who's in Charge? Science, Mind and Free Will, 2013. Thus, it is not only the arrow of time to be taken into account, but also the complementarity of brain processes. For Libet, consciousness is something mechanical, triggered at a certain moment. For Gazzaniga it is instead a phenomenon emerging from the complexity of brain activity. Action is the product of components originating both outside and inside the brain. This view refers more or less directly to the cybernetic strand of investigation applied to the functioning of the mind, emergentism. For this current, falling within the sphere of the philosophy of mind, the mind is a phenomenon emerging from the interaction between various physical, organic and inorganic components. Mental phenomena would thus be emergent properties of the brain. Gregory Bateson in Towards an Ecology of Mind argues that a part cannot control the whole, and asks, can a computer think? Is the mind only inside the brain? A computer is programmed to turn on the fan when its mechanisms heat up, and thus adopts mind-like behavior. Bateson says that the mind is immanent to the brain's brain circuits, which are connected to the rest of the body, which in turn is embedded in a larger human environment system. We can thus greatly expand the limits of the I by introducing the category of the extended self or, better, that spatially extended self. To explain this concept, Bateson gives an example. When a woodcutter is intent on chopping down a tree, he initiates a self-correcting process. Each stroke of the axe modifies the tree, and this modifies the woodcutter's subsequent behavior, i.e. the way he will hold the axe and the force he will impart to the next stroke. The complex of these actions represents a mental system that retroacts on itself. A system that transforms differences produces other differences, which produce new units of information. In this circular path it is difficult to understand where the self begins and ends. We can apply the reasoning made for the woodcutter to the man-computer relationship and to the wider man-computer relationship plus the internet. The total self-correcting unit that processes information, or which, as I say, thinks, and acts and decides, is a system whose boundaries do not at all coincide with the boundaries of the body or what is vulgarly called the I or consciousness, and it is important to note that there are multiple differences between the thinking system and the I as it is vulgarly conceived. Bateson, Towards an Ecology of Mind. Kurzweil, who is a leading exponent of transhumanism, a current that sees the future as an ever closer fusion of man with machine, which will lead man to immortality, asks the following question in his book How to Create a Mind, given that there are technological devices permanently implanted inside and outside the human body, which amplify the senses and capacities, where does personal identity go? Kurzweil is convinced that in a few decades' time there will be microscopic technological devices, nanorobots, that will be permanently implanted in the body and will have the task of repairing what is damaged or signaling dysfunctions to computers set up so that action can be taken in good time. According to the law of accelerating returns, each new technological advance makes several higher-level advances possible. Technologies miniaturize and do so faster and faster. Will we still be a us in a few decades when we are full of technological devices and equipment implanted or circulating inside our bodies? At what point will we have transformed into something else? Biologically speaking, the body renews itself almost entirely through cell death, apoptosis, but now a further process of renewal is taking place, this time artificially, through prostheses of various kinds. Neuralink, Elon Musk's neurotechnology company, aims to directly connect the human brain to computers by means of a device implanted inside our heads, brain-computer interface. There are already robotic prostheses that can operate by connecting directly to the brain, thus enabling the paralyzed to communicate and perform actions that would otherwise be impossible. We can modify ourselves by intervening in biology through technology. The artificial now dominates the biological in production as in so many other areas of life. This raises a lot of questions of an ethical nature. Think of eugenics, a subject we have addressed in some of our magazine articles. It is the advent of the personal digital twin in recent years, a digital twin of ourselves, which accumulates data on us, from tastes, to habits, to state of health, through sensors such as the mobile phone, tablet and smartwatch, processes them in real time and predicts future scenarios, guiding us in our everyday choices. With this virtual assistant monitoring, planning, designing and choosing for us, what will remain, many wonder, of free will, of individual autonomy? Today, sociologists present various conceptions of the self, ecological, somatic, narrative, extended, social, etc., which means that it is a concept that is difficult to frame and that even those in the know struggle to define. One has to wonder, in light of the latest technological innovations, whether our I also includes our digital twin or our avatar in the metaverse. For communists, the I is not something sacred, nor is it something that can be defined once and for all. It only exists as a social ego, a dynamic entity, not as an isolated and independent reality, except on an ideological level. For Marx, the human being is not an abstraction immanent to the single individual. In its reality, it is the totality of social relations. Theses on Feuerbach, 6. Natural-born cyborgs. In 1998, Andy Clark and David Chalmers, the former lecturer in logic and metaphysics at Edinburgh, the latter in philosophy of mind at the Australian National University and New York University, published the essay The Extended Mind. The two researchers are proponents of the extended mind model, i.e. they deny any interest in the boundaries between mind, body and environment, rejecting dualism in all its forms, and emphasize the importance of factors external to the nervous system in the formation of the conscious mind. There is always a dynamic whole comprising the brain body and the environment in which it is embedded. In some ways, Marx also spoke of the extended mind in the Grundrisse, introducing the definition of general intellect. A molecular biologist such as Joel de Rosnay coined the neologism Cyberian to define the symbiotic relationship between man and the world he produces. A half-biological, half-artificial superorganism is in fact taking shape. De Rosnay notes how many biological functions can now be duplicated on machines, and these machines are acquiring quasi-biological characteristics. Our extracorporeal evolution, networks, computers, etc., is now an established fact, and a current of thought has arisen that attempts to grasp its epistemological implications. This is externalism, a position inherent in the philosophy of mind, in contrast to internalism, according to which the mind emerges exclusively from neuronal activity. For externalism, cognitive processes are also a product of extraorganic material, as evidenced by our increasingly close relationship with technology. So we must not fixate on the material of the mind, but study how information is transmitted from one place to another. What is the organization that makes its transmission possible? The medium, from this point of view, as cyberneticians claim, is completely neutral. The theorists of the extended mind ask themselves, where does the mind end and the rest of the world begin? And they give themselves the following answer: there is nothing sacred in the skull and skin. Information processing can also take place outside the human body by means of extensions of various kinds. We live in an integrated mind-brain-body environment system. Artifact is also language. Or rather, the alphabet is a set of artifacts that make language possible. Our species has actually always been a cyborg. Now the boundary between the organic and the inorganic is increasingly blurred, so much so that in recent decades a literature has flourished that goes by the name of cyberpunk, whose most famous interpreters are William Gibson, Neil Stephenson, and Bruce Sterling. In addition to the natural sense organs, we have built artificial ones, which enhance our capacities. Nature transforms itself into industry through man, so's true anthropological nature is the nature-man industry complex. Science of man and nature will one day be integrated, and then there will be but one science. The Marx of the 1844 manuscripts was a cyberneticist ante litteram. Now that this process has come of age, those who deal with new technologies in relation to social transformations, even if they do not explicitly refer to Marxism, are forced to capitulate ideologically before it. When our technologies adapt to us as actively, automatically, and continuously as we adapt to them, then the line between the tool and its user becomes uncertain. These technologies will be less and less tools and more part of people's mental apparatus. They will remain tools only in the paradoxical sense that my neural structures operating unconsciously are tools. Natural-born cyborgs, Andy Clark, 2003. Clark and Chalmers differentiate between transparent artifacts, chips in the brain or pacemakers in the chest, and opaque ones, visible and external, such as glasses or a cochlear implant. But on what basis is an instrument classifiable in one field or the other? The difference is not always clear-cut. Think of our compulsive use of smartphones and other technological devices, which track our every preference, habit or taste, depositing it all in gigantic digital archives, from which companies fish data for targeted advertising. Mobile phones are external to us, to our bodies, but without them in our everyday lives, we would be lost. Those who work at the cutting edge of technology define as symbiotic autonomous systems the collaborative environment that are generated by the increasingly close interaction between human beings and machines. The self, at this point, becomes a collection of biological and artificial elements mixed together. And so it deflates, fades, vanishes. Let us hear how our current approaches the subject in Superman Muddled, 1953. Marx announced to the modern state the fate of being smashed and shattered. Engels and himself defined the fate of the revolutionary state, which would follow him, as a slow disappearance. The ego of exception has the same fate, to perish, to empty itself, to deflate, to dissolve, sich Auflösen, to extinguish itself, to die out, sich Auflöschen, as in Engels. Lenin had another expressive term, to slumber, slumber of great men. Where the revolution did not arrive, crushed by decades of demo-fascist Stalinist superhomism, technological development arrived. And this has led to the production of new, cybernetic theories, such as those of Clark, Chalmers, Bateson and others, which can be counted among the ideological capitulations, and therefore deserve to be studied. The important thing is not to fall into the trap of the mind as an infinitely extended and therefore indefinable process, which would lead to the famous Night of the Black Cows. Investigation into the laws of thought. Let us turn to neuroscientist Vilena Ramachandran to provide a bit of background on the structures and components of our brain, just to say how dense this organ is with hubs and links, and therefore how difficult it is to understand its functioning. The human brain, it is said, is the most complex structure in the universe. To realize this, just consider a few figures. It is made up of 100 billion neurons, the nerve cells that are the fundamental structural and functional units of the nervous system, and each neuron has between 1,000 and 10,000 points of contact or synapses with the others. It is in the synapses that the exchange of information takes place. Based on this data, it has been calculated that the number of possible permutations and combinations of brain activity, i.e. the number of mental states, exceeds the number of elementary particles in the known universe. What we know about the mind. The brain, despite being so complex, is comparable to a supercomputer. It cannot be otherwise. Otherwise we would have to believe that it responds to different laws from those that explain the functioning of the rest of the world. Even if we do not know it in depth, it is clear that its functioning can be explained by resorting to digital, quantifiable elements, i.e. bits, without the need to fall back on the anti-historical concepts of soul or spirit. The basic elements that make the brain work are neurons and synapses. Synaptic connections are activated by the transmission of a nerve impulse, like the neurons in the brain. The billions of individual neurons that make up the human species, by exchanging information and interacting with each other, form a planetary social brain. On a similar basis, the mathematician John von Neumann devised a computer model in the mid-1940s that envisages the existence of a processor or central processing unit, in which arithmetic and logical operations are performed, a memory in which the program and data are stored, and input-output channels. The connection between these subsystems is made by a special device called a bus. In 1956 von Neumann began to accumulate material that he would discuss in various lectures that were later used for the posthumous publication of his book The Computer and the Brain in 1958, in which he explained how the brain can be understood as a kind of computer, composed of parallel and series patterns. Von Neumann's is one of the first studies of the brain from the perspective of logic and computer science. He notes how the output of neurons is digital, an axon, an extension of the nerve cell that transmits nerve impulses from the cell body to the periphery, either activates or does not activate, generates or does not generate the nerve impulse. There are therefore rules that govern the functioning of the brain on a par with those that govern computers. In building computers, humans took their cue from something that already existed. For materialists, the category of creation does not exist. The brain is a mixed system, digital and analog together, and therefore not yet fully simulatable by the machine, as it is difficult to reproduce in all its complexity. It may not even be useful to arrive at its complete technical reproducibility. What is of interest is the enhancement of human intelligence by means of computer prosthesis. However, a conception of consciousness as a biocomputational capacity, which is different from the computational capacity of the machine, is emerging. Some argue horrified that the basic functioning of the brain cannot be reduced to the binary operation of computers, 0 and 1, on and off. However, as Dennett argues, any finite alphabet of signals with equivalent classes represents a type of digitization. The communist brain form. the popularizer of science Douglas Hofstadter has long investigated the similarities between the human and animal worlds, devoting one of the most interesting dialogues in his book Gödel, Escher, Bark, An Eternal Brilliant Garland, to the comparison between the life of the anthill animated by the incessant work of ants and that of the brain made possible by the cooperation of billions of neurons. He sees a strong similarity between the ants in the anthill and the neurons in the brain. The cooperation between individual units, based on relatively simple instructions, produces something very complex. No ant, like no neuron, can function on its own. In the quoted text, Hofstadter makes some very interesting observations. He argues that an anthill inside is organized according to communistic principles. Communism dominates at the level of the ants. In an anthill all the ants work for the common good, and sometimes even against their own individual interests, but it is very likely that the anthill has no consciousness of being communist. As a rule, human beings know nothing about their neurons. In truth, they are even glad they know nothing about their brains. Most of humanity knows nothing about the communist organization inherent in its very structure. As we have said, in the factory's internal production plan there is the negation of the law of value. Since the partial workers do not exchange goods but pass semi-finished products to each other, they collaborate, and they do so without being aware of the communist organization, associated labor, inherent in the capitalist structure itself. Of this contradictory movement within the capitalist mode of production, communists are aware that it is precisely in this functioning that they see how communism is not a utopia or an ideology, but is material movement that negates the existing. Studies on neural networks are fundamental to understanding how the brain works and being able to simulate it. Apparently, we are the only organism on Earth so complex that it has undertaken the arduous task of deciphering its own programming language. For some years now, neuroscientific research has focused on the connectome, i.e. the comprehensive mapping of all neural connections in the brain, which constantly change over time, in order to understand how this organ processes information. In the wake of the Human Genome Project, the Human Connectome Project was born in 2009. The aim is to access the biological basis of our identity. With the development of this branch, perhaps tomorrow it will be possible to do mind uploading, the transfer of the human mind into a computer or robot. Reality, in this case, would surpass science fiction. Biophysicist Stuart Kaufman shows how the functioning of the genome resembles the functioning of a computer, working in parallel, executing instructions according to binary logic. The same can be said for neurons, which receive information via the dendrites, their extensions that carry the nerve impulse from the periphery towards the cell body, and transmit it to other neurons via the axon. Every brain develops peculiar neural networks, connections between brain areas that shape and reshape themselves according to the stimuli received. In addition to our genes, it is the experiences we have of the world around us through our sense organs, eyes, ears, mouth, nose, and skin, that determine our identity, which is precisely something that changes over time. In 1943, neurophysiologist Warren McCulloch and mathematician Walter Pitts, investigating together the relationship between logic and nerve networks, came up with a model of the central nervous system. McCulloch and Pitts considered the neuron to be the hub, body, of a network of links, axons, endowed with a certain number of inputs and a certain number of outputs, and demonstrated that the complexity of the brain could be reduced to a series of simple mechanisms, as Alan Turing had done with his universal machine. Man cannot create anything, but he can transform matter and thus transform himself. Now that we have managed to reproduce part of what we are in an inanimate medium, i.e. to engineer part of our way of reasoning, we are working on both weak, rationality, and strong, reasonableness, artificial intelligence. And we find that an MRI tells us more about the brain than many philosophical treatises on the workings of the mind. When it methinks, this particular organ produces heat and thus consumes energy, and the consumption is quantifiable. We know that the brain is an efficient machine that requires little energy to run, much less than the average modern computer takes. Some physicists argue that the notion of time, i.e. the one-way arrow, finds its origin precisely in the dissipation of heat that takes place in the brain. Carlo Rovelli, in his book L'ordine del tempo, notes that every time there is a difference between past and future, the second principle of thermodynamics is involved. The brain, for materialists, is nothing more than a perfected computational machine with a remarkable capacity for self-organization. Think of the essay Investigation of the Laws of Thought, on which the mathematical theories of logic and probability are based, by the mathematician George Bull. He identified all statements with 0 and 1, and thought of his system as a mathematics without numbers. Or rather, the only numbers allowed were 0, nothing, and 1, universe. Bull argued that the mathematical laws associated with the use of logical symbols are nothing but laws of thought. A revolutionary statement to have been made in the mid-19th century. In general, many of the groupings that claim to be communists have not even reached the level of these achievements of the bourgeoisie, which laid the foundations of computer science. In fact, many revolutionaries openly say that they are not interested in today's scientific production. There is a tragic lack of theory and even curiosity towards knowledge, bourgeois or species, and this also has repercussions for the current state of the class struggle, as we wrote in the articles Where Has the Future Gone? n+1 number 46. The Free Prisoner. This is the title of Giuseppe Trotta's essay, an obvious oxymoron, on which all the reasoning contained therein revolves, which we will analyze. We take this opportunity to reiterate that the bourgeoisie is aware that determinism operates in physics, but denies that this is valid in the study of society, unlike Marxism, which identifies laws that regulate the functioning of human societies. Nevertheless, the bourgeois working in certain scientific fields are forced to ask themselves questions and arrive deterministically at certain conclusions. These are isolated cases, but lately voices against the tide are increasing. Trotter is one of these, physicist and computer scientist, interested in the topics of cybernetics and computability, evolutionary algorithms, neural networks, computational complexity theory, computational modeling, etc. He has also dealt with free will, and in the book under review, in the first pages, he asks, is there someone inside me, inside this body? When we perform an action we feel a sense of belonging, we naturally think that the choice is ours, but if this were true it would mean that we have the ability to change the course of events that might otherwise have been different. Are we that powerful? Is it the mind acting on the brain or vice versa? Besides, who determined that I write the things I am writing? If I did not decide the choice, which was also made by my body, who decided? No one. What has happened is that the brain in its normal functioning has made what we call a decision from the outside. But there is no decision. The brain is a normal, albeit complex, piece of the universe. It is connected with the outside, it has memory, and it is perfectly plausible that it manages its own conduct and that of the body of which it is a part. In this conduct there will certainly be choices. Indeed, the management of a body and a brain is an uninterrupted succession of more or less important choices. But unlike the mind that decides the choices, here the choices are natural occurrences perfectly justified by the material situation of the moment. In reality, they are not choices, but consequences of the previous state of the brain and the universe. The free prisoner. Trotter argues that man, like the computer, makes choices, or rather, makes decisions, according to a procedure, an algorithm, reasoning in this way as a materialist. In principle, the current view of man is based on Cartesian dualism, residential cogitans, residential extensor. The mind is something immaterial and spiritual, the body something material and mechanical. The immaterial acts on the material. Mental freedom and physical necessity are two different things, although there is a dialectical relationship between the two. For Descartes, the connection between the two worlds is made possible by the pineal gland, the link between soul and body. Before Descartes and his mechanistic dualism, men had given themselves tools to help them make decisions. Through shamans and by following special rituals, reading animal entrails, coffee grounds, etc., they made prophecies to bring the two worlds, the material world of the body and the immaterial world of the soul, into contact. Those who turn to astrology today think that there is a preordained plan independent of the individual that can be deciphered through certain procedures. With the advent of bourgeois society came the individual, the creator of his own destiny and fortune, enterprising, industrious. Interesting in this respect is the debate between Martin Luther and Erasmus of Rotterdam on free will. Luther denies man's freedom to choose between good and evil, while the Catholic Erasmus, a true bourgeois, strongly affirms it. That the individual was born recently is argued by the Russian historian Aaron J. Gievis in his book The Birth of the Individual in Medieval Europe, who identifies its appearance in history with the great empires and great conquests. The bourgeois revolution produces its human instruments, its powerful megaphones. One of these is Pierre-Simon Laplace, a French mathematician, physicist and astronomer, a representative of the new revolution in science, for whom once we understand all the positions and motions of particles of matter at a given instant, we will be able to mathematically calculate their positions and motions at any future instant in the life of the cosmos. Thanks to the tools of mathematics, we can discover the laws that govern the universe. For Galileo, science can bring us closer to divine knowledge. Indeed, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, whose characters are triangles, circles, and figures. Returning to Trotter's The Free Prisoner, he lists the various possible definitions of freedom. Physical freedom, that of the individual who can alter the physical world. Mental freedom, that of the individual to think at will. Epistemic freedom, one cannot predict what one will do before the choice has been made. Social and political freedom, that of the French Revolution, ideology. Psychoanalytic freedom, self-therapy allows one to gain control over one's own mind. Quantum freedom, it is not true that the world is determined because there is a dualism between micro and macro worlds. We human beings think that we are the first cause of our actions, and this is normal, because this is how we perceive ourselves in the world. There are biological, historical, and social causes that drive us to think this way. As neuroscientist David Eagleman writes, the conscious mind is very good at telling itself the fairy tale of being in charge. But free will is a mere illusion, comparable to the Muller-Lyer length illusion, which consists of the perception, in the two figures compared, of one line being longer than the other, or the Ebbinghaus illusion in which one central circle appears larger than the other. Neuroscience has shown that we react instinctively to certain visual stimuli, enacting given actions, and are only aware of what we are doing later. We have evolved this way because when dangerous situations arise, there is no time to think and automatisms must be triggered immediately to activate behaviors that will save us. As we have seen, that thing that we call consciousness does not seem to pervade all mental activity, but only a small part of it, and even this needs to be clarified. Most of the actions we perform take place under the command of an automatic pilot. Tests have shown that in a natural relationship between predator and prey, the latter can never spend too much time thinking. Therefore, in the presence of a potentially dangerous figure, it develops a rapid, elementary perception. When an asymmetrical figure enters its field of vision, it means that it is in the vicinity of an animal seen from the side, so it assumes an attitude of let's see what happens. If, on the other hand, an axially symmetrical figure enters his field of vision, it means animal seen from the front, possible attack, flight or defense. Doing, saying, thinking, knowing, n+1 n=38. Every direct experience we have of the world is filtered by the sense organs and then processed by the brain. What we see is therefore our own reconstruction of reality. There is a difference between perception, senses, and reality, measurement, as demonstrated, for example, by the picture of the pencil dipped in a transparent glass filled with water, which to our eyes looks bent, but in fact is not bent at all. We see it curved due to the refraction of the water. Perception is the trigger for beginning to know, but we can no longer rely on it after the advent of science, i.e. intersubjective knowledge based on a precise method of investigation. We have chronologically 3 stages that lead us to the scientific understanding of reality. 1. Primary illusory experience. 2. Secondary experience of an analytical nature and ascertainment of the betrayal of the senses. 3. Clarification and explanation of the contrast between the two experiences. Psychologist Daniel Wegner says in his essay The Illusion of Conscious Will that consciousness is a mere illusion of our brain. Free will is nothing but a feeling experienced by an individual. It stands to action as the experience of pain stands to the bodily changes brought about by the painful stimulus. He is echoed by Professor of Neurosurgery and Neurology Arnoldo Bernini who, in his essay Neurobiology of the Will, states, cognitive neuroscience, with its studies on consciousness and self-consciousness, has demonstrated with a myriad of experiments that before any action, mechanical or mental, the specific brain areas of that activity are active before one is conscious of what will happen. The moment the areas of self-consciousness in the prefrontal lobes receive the information of what the specific areas have decided to do, one becomes not only aware of what the brain has arranged, but also certain that our will has made that choice totally free of the physicochemical mechanisms of the brain areas. And that is an illusion, because we are what the brain makes us to be and nothing more. The philosopher John Searle, as we have seen, criticizes such positions, being an asserter of the existence of qualia, phenomena that cannot be objectively quantified and are not reducible to the neurophysiological processes of the brain. Our conscious states would be, according to him, systemic characteristics of the brain, qualities superior to the physical elements, neurons, synapses, microtubules, etc., and not explicable from them. Searle argues that if we fully accepted the idea that there is no free will, that the conscious self is a mere illusion of the brain, we would be facing an epistemological revolution far greater than the Copernican and Einsteinian one. It would be a paradigm shift that would upset, negatively, for Searle, the foundations of society. For Trotter, the problem of brain-mind dualism persists and is problematic for man today, because at present we have not yet solved the problem of what matter is and how mind emanates from its particular organization, the brain-body. However, it is clear that the existence of free will clashes with the very laws of nature. If the mind, via the brain, has the free will to steer the course of the universe in a specific direction between two or more hypothetically possible directions, this means that we need to review what a law of nature is. There would be a fundamental and as yet unknown connection between consciousness, will and the ultimate nature of matter. The free prisoner. During an interview on YouTube, the interview asks Trotter what the social consequences of the denial of free will might be, and he replies that in fact it is good that these issues remain within restricted circles. If this new worldview, based on a widespread certainty that determinism operates in societies, were to spread, social problems could ensue, causing a dramatic upheaval in man. These considerations are of no scientific interest. On the contrary, it is clear that only through the negation of the concept of free will can we better understand human behavior. There must be a biological evolutionary explanation for why humans feel that they are the sole and exclusive sources of their own actions. Perhaps through free will, a substitute for fate, they have become more self-confident in a world where they are driven to believe that they can survive on their own, through their own individual choices and actions. Arnoldo Bernini develops a curious theory, according to which, although free will is only an epiphenomenon, the belief that it exists is beneficial because it saves humanity from itself. Indeed, to overcome the overwhelming sense of absolute constraint on the nervous mechanisms of the will, evolution has selected the nervous mechanism of the illusion of its freedom. Now, because we live in the prehistory of human society, we still cannot overcome the self-deception mechanisms we have put in place as a species to make sense of the big questions concerning the meaning of life and death. We need a social revolution, an enormous physical fact, to be able to begin to shed light on our way of knowing. Scientific research alone is not enough. What will become of free will? Tomorrow's society will see the social metabolism characteristic of early communism reintroduced at a higher level. Having left behind an animal social form, humanity will finally begin to know itself, its origins, its limits, and its potential. There will thus be a transition from prehistory to history, through a revolutionary becoming that will break the previous balances, finally putting philosophy, religion, and ideology to bed. There will no longer be the individual atomized alienate, but an individual community nature understood as a cell of a social organism, which feels an integral part of it, and which completes itself in it. In the original communism, the notion of free will did not exist, nor did the notion of the individual, at least as we understand it today. The same applies to the idea of consciousness. Psychologist Julian Jaynes writes in his essay The Collapse of the Bicameral Mind and the Origin of Consciousness, analyzing the Greek epic poem par excellence. The men of the Iliad have no will of their own and certainly no notion of free will. Indeed, the whole problem of volition, a problem so difficult, in my opinion, for modern psychological theory, is perhaps so difficult precisely because the words to designate such phenomena were invented only so late. For Jaynes, in other times there were men who talked, reasoned and solved problems, who did almost everything we do today, but who were not conscious at all. These men did not perceive their actions as coming exclusively from within their bodies, their minds. They were externalists without knowing they were. In fact, it is hard to imagine that the man of the original communism felt separate and independent from the community he belonged to, that he thought he had his own consciousness, as the individual of today, who leads a meaningless life, does. The characteristic of the communist man of tomorrow will be to live in symbiosis with the human community and the environment around him. He will no longer be the owner of himself, i.e. of his body, his choices, his actions, his things, because ownership will have been overcome. None of us can claim property rights over his carcass, valid or not, which belongs to the social man. Bodega to the Negroes, the 24th of November, 1957. Quite rightly, our current reiterates that the project, the overthrow of praxis, is a product of social man, not the individual as Marx, manuscripts of 1844, the individual knows through the species, in addition to the immediate organs, social organs are formed, but this overthrow is in reality not a product exclusive to the human species, unless one thinks of it as external and above the rest of nature. Quite the contrary, it is nature that organizes itself through its various sense organs, among which is man-industry, evolving towards higher states of order. The holonic theory developed by the writer-philosopher Arthur Kiesler, who formulated it in the late 1970s, describes nature as a kind of matryoshka doll. The word holon comes from the Greek and means portion of the whole. An individual is an olon insofar as he is part of the society with which he interacts. A group of individuals that is related to a whole made up of interacting groups is also an olon. Today, as we live in a networked society, it is easier to grasp the deeper meaning of this theory. There are self-organizing processes of matter at all levels. Kaufmann's theory of autocatalytic ensembles describes human organization as a form of natural system that is self-organizing. This process is the result of a catalyzing effect, i.e. nature's organizational capacity, which consists of the ability to develop coherent, repeated, and complex patterns between the elements that make up a system. The phenomenon life is in principle a whole with the phenomenon non-life, although they are still considered separate. From a theoretical point of view, the possibility exists of making matter think, not least because we ourselves are thinking matter. For the encyclopedist Denis Diderot, thinking is only a matter of the sufficient complexity of matter. According to Giacomo Leopardi, everything is matter, therefore everything thinks. For Einstein, matter, energy, and thought are equivalent. This materialistic view of thought and life leads us quite consequently to introduce the theme of negentropy, which we will explore in more detail in subsequent works, a word that is synonymous with organization, information, and design. Man is no different from nature, he can only transform through his work what he finds around him. And his work is purposeful, it has as its objective the preservation and improvement of living conditions, today of the individual and his circle, family, tribe, clan, nation, tomorrow of the whole species. When a mode of production no longer responds to the needs of the majority of society, it is destined to be superseded. This is a law of nature. Having emphasized this, let us reiterate a fundamental aspect: man's work is not his own. As usual, there is a difficulty in expressing this in current language. It is nature's work, made possible by the energy that arrives on Earth from the sun. For Marxist science, although there is no land rent that is not exploitation of man, appropriation of value, payment by society to the peasant, the agricultural product is the product of nature, since man and his work are also. They are, in fact, the product of an infinitesimal part of the energy that the sun diffuses into space and that, upon meeting the Earth, gives rise to the chemism of life. In the classless society no one will appropriate, no one will pay in it. Having rationally resolved the man-nature relationship, the species will not need to separate the work of man from that of the sun. Introductory outline of the agrarian question, 1953. There are in living organisms processes of organizational growth that negate entropy, chaos, not in absolute terms, but in some place and for some time, pouring disorder elsewhere. In Ludwig von Bertalanffy's general systems theory, the living world is described as a transition towards higher orders of complexity, towards heterogeneity and organization. The growth of information leads to a decrease in disorder. The reversal of praxis. Regarding the growth of information within phase transitions from one order to another, it is useful to take up the contents of the debate between the mathematician René Thom and the chemist and physicist Ilya Prigogine on bifurcations, a topic we have already addressed in the article The Reversal of Praxis, n+1 number 19. Complex systems are difficult to understand, but they are not by their very nature indeterminable, as the indeterminists claim, who identify fluctuation the trigger that causes all subsequent development. Thom, in his article Enough About Chance, Shut Up the Noise, argues that chance is an empty concept and therefore devoid of scientific interest. Determinism, on the other hand, is a fascinating object for those who can examine it. Too hastily, in his opinion, Prigogine and Stengers in their essay The New Alliance dismissed Laplacian determinism At the moment of the revolutionary bifurcation, going left or right is not due to chance, i.e. it is not an irreducibly random, aleatory element, as Prigogine argues, but is determined by all the past and surroundings, boundary conditions, that led to that event. Ultimately, we can say that the bifurcation exists only for us, subjectively, who cannot always determine its outcome. Topologically speaking, the current mode of production deforms until it reaches a moment when it transforms, becomes something else. Think of the beam that when subjected to a certain weight breaks. The moment of breakage is nothing but the result of the past of that particular structure and prefigures its future state. Having established that there is clear and demonstrable determination from the past to the present, we deduce that the same determination acts from the present to the future, even if we are unable to predict for each system its next state. Henri Poincaré argued that in systems characterized by the presence of singularity factors, we can predict the set of future behaviors, but not what will actually be adopted. To accurately predict the future position of all particles would require a mind equal to that of God. We poor mortals must be content to advance in knowledge a little at a time, using the tools at our disposal. Today, we talk quietly about deterministic chaos because we also see regularities within complex systems. On the other hand, if we could not detect them within a highly complex system like capitalism, we could not speak of the dynamics of modes of production. Not even the collective organism that is the Communist Party has free will, it is the product and factor of a historical dynamic that leads to a result. Without the formation of this particular structure, revolutionary rupture is impossible. The current we refer to in coining the formula of organic centralism in its theses wish to draw a parallel between the Revolutionary Party and living organisms, which metabolize and carry out their activities without each cell having to see another particular cell as a commander or subordinate. The party is a determined and determining factor of change. It cannot do what it wants, when it wants and how it wants, and that is why the communist left has established a short list of tactical possibilities to achieve the goals for which the party was created. It is the end that determines the means to achieve it. Tom, criticizing Prigogine, by no means excluded that the dynamics of complex systems contain singular points that lead to bifurcations, or, if the bifurcation is impassable, to catastrophe. However, a sufficiently complete examination of the basis on which the system develops would make it possible to predict a priori the possible outcomes of the bifurcation, which pre-exists the triggering fluctuation. It is the latter's role to trigger the process and possibly determine, with an apparently arbitrary choice, among all possible outcomes the further evolution. But it certainly does not create it. What we have called a Marxism throughout this article for the sake of exposition, but which would be more correct to call revolutionary theory, cannot be reduced to detailed theses, political, trade union, etc., because it is a general, monistic conception of the world. Bordiga says this clearly in his interview with journalist Sergio Zavoli, Storia Contemporanea, No. 3, September 1973, commenting on the speech he gave at the Third Congress of the Communist Party of Italy in Lyon in 1926. I declared, addressed to Antonio Gramsci, that one is not entitled to declare oneself a Marxist, or even a historical materialist, just because one accepts as party baggage certain detailed theses, which may refer either to trade union action, economics, or to parliamentary tactics, or to questions of race, religion, culture, but one is rightly under the same political banner only when one believes in the same conception of the universe, of history and of man's task in it. Why does Bordiga, at that politically problematic historical juncture, bring up the communist conception of the universe? Only to criticize the political paucity of the Gramscians with whom he clashed there and elsewhere? We believe there was something deeper in that discourse, namely the idea that communism as a theory is not only about human facts but is to be included in the broader process of development of the universe. There are general laws that explain the transitions from one form to another in various spheres, physical, chemical, biological and social. It is no coincidence that in recent years, theories of everything, of networks, of complexity, of systems, etc. have arisen. Wanting to make a reference to literature, another important branch of human knowledge, let us recall that the I, understood as the bearer of rights, consciousness and freedom, is ridiculed by a writer with a sense of humor like Carlo Emilio Gadda, who hated personal pronouns as much as the annoying parasites that live on the scalp. Pronouns. They are the lice of thought. When thought has lice, it scratches itself, like everyone else who has lice, and in its nails, then, it finds pronouns there, the pronouns of person. La Cognizione del Dolor, 1963. Gadda mocks the excessive use of the I, the filthiest of all pronouns. And he does so with good reason, given that what is understood in this society as the work of the one, competing with other ones, is instead the product of multiple connections and interweavings in space and time. The achievements of the individual are always a product of the species, because the individual is nothing more than a cell of the species. Even communists, therefore, hate that personal pronoun, and in fact in our editorial code the use of the I has been deleted, the we unfortunately still resists even when it could be replaced by impersonal forms. To conclude, considering that experiences and activities modify the structure of our cerebral cortex, even the deterministic theory denying the existence of free will acts in this sense, modifying existing synapses, generating new neural networks, and thus producing material effects.